So today is December 9, 2015, and we are in Hanukkah. So let's pray and then get into things. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for your many blessings. Thank you for revealing to us this message of present truth. And one of the greatest things that we want to thank you for is guiding us to think in a different way from how we have ever thought before. Thank you for expanding our thinking to include more of what we need to include in our discussions and in our investigation of truth. And we know that there's a lot more to go still, and that you have more training and retraining for our minds. And we eagerly look forward to that and seek that. So help us tonight to be able to think clearly and according to reason and love and truth. Help us to understand the significant historical events of the past and to understand their import for understanding the life of your Son while he walked among us, and also in understanding today. So thank you so much for all this, Heavenly Family. We ask these things in the name of Branch.
Amen.
All right. So last night we were going through the last two chapters of Book 11 of Josephus Antiquities of the Jews. And so tonight we're going to be starting into Book 12. And last night Teresa and I were talking after the meeting just about how significant it is to learn of these things. It's just such a gap in our understanding and in our knowledge. And that gap is now being filled. And, looking at some of the historical writings in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Old Testaments, you find books like Kings and Chronicles and Esther and, various books like this, which are basically simply a historical account of what took place prior to the writing of those books. And that's very, very similar to what we find here in Josephus, written by a historian who we actually know who he was. Some of these other writings, such as Kings, Chronicles, Esther, whatever, we don't necessarily know who wrote them, other than that they are a historical account. So in one sense, at least, they're written by historians, obviously ancient historians rather than modern historians. But this information, this period of time that we are reading about, is at least as important as the period of time recorded in Kings and Chronicles and in the other historical works that ended up being in the Old Testament. So kind of painting things in that light, and I guess that could be expanded more, and we could talk about exactly how we view writings like this as compared to the historical writings in the quote-unquote Bible. But I think that's kind of just introducing these writings in that way, I think should call our minds to hopefully see the importance of reading things like this a little bit more than maybe we would otherwise. So again, if anyone wants to be able to read Antiquities of the Jews, as we are continuing on tonight, you can go to earlyjewishwritings.com, which is linked to on the resources page of the website. And close to the bottom of the page, it'll have the works of Josephus. And we are in Antiquities, Book 12, chapter 1. So would anyone like to start off with reading from chapter 1 of book 12?
Okay. From the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Judas Maccabeus.
That's book 12, the title for book 12.
And it's containing the interval of 170 years. So, chapter 1. How Ptolemy took Jerusalem and Judea by deceit and treachery, and carried many thence, and planted them in Egypt. Now, when Alexander, king of Macedon, had put an end to the dominion of the Persians, and had settled the affairs in Judea after the forementioned manner, he ended his life. And as his government fell among many, Antigonus obtained Asia, Seleucus Babylon, and of the other nations which were there, Lysimachus governed the Hellespont, and Cassander possessed Macedonia, as did Ptolemy the son of Lagus seize upon Egypt. And while these princes ambitiously strove one against another, every one for his own principality, it came to pass that there were continual wars, and those lasting wars too. And the cities were sufferers, and lost a great many of their inhabitants in these times of distress, insomuch that all Syria, by the means of Ptolemy the son of Lagus, underwent the reverse of that denomination of Savior which he then had. He also seized upon Jerusalem, and for that end made use of deceit and treachery. For as he came into the city on a Sabbath day, as if he would offer sacrifices, he, without any trouble, gained the city, while the Jews did not oppose him, for they did not suspect him to be their enemy. And he gained it thus, because they were free from suspicion of him, and because on that day they were at rest and quietness. And when he had gained it, he ruled over it in a cruel manner. Okay, give me a second to think out this word. Nay, Agatharchides of not Sinaitis. Wow, these are some words, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of Sinaitis, who wrote the acts of Alexander's successors, reproaches us with superstition, as if we, by it, had lost our liberty. Where he says thus, quote, there is a nation called the nation of the Jews, who inhabit a city strong and great, named Jerusalem. These men took no care, but let it come into the hands of Ptolemy, as not willing to take arms, and thereby they submitted to be under a hard master by reason of their unseasonable superstition, end quote. So basically it sounds like he's saying that Sabbath keeping and not fighting and not bearing arms was just superstition.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Agatharchides or Agatharchides relates of our nation. But when Ptolemy had taken a great many captives, both from the mountainous parts of Judea and from the places about Jerusalem and Samaria, and the places near Mount Gerizim, he led them all into Egypt and settled them there. Now, I did mean to look at the first footnote up there when it says that he pretended to offer sacrifices. So footnote number 1, that's interesting. It doesn't seem to be fitting. Here, Josephus uses the very word koinotagia.
Yeah, that's not it.
That's a different one, but that's where it took me.
Where is it that you're seeing?
Right here.
Yeah, that's definitely not the right one. And mine doesn't have one there, I don't think.
Okay, that must just be a typo. There's lots of typos in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, footnote number 2, which is right here where it says he led them all into Egypt. That says, the great number of these Jews and Samaritans that were formerly carried into Egypt by Alexander and now by Ptolemy the son of Lagus appear afterwards in the vast multitude who, as we shall see presently, were soon ransomed by Philadelphus, and by him made free, before he sent for the 72 interpreters, in the many garrisons and other soldiers of that nation in Egypt, in the famous settlement of Jews, and the number of their synagogues at Alexandria long afterward, and in the vehement contention between the Jews and Samaritans under Philometor, about the place appointed for public worship in the law of Moses, whether at the Jewish temple of Jerusalem or at the Samaritan temple of Gerizim, of all which our author treats hereafter. And as to the Samaritans carried into Egypt under the same princes, Scaliger supposes that those who have a great synagogue at Cairo, as also those whom the Arabic geographer speaks of as having seized on an island in the Red Sea, are remains of them at this very day, as the notes here inform us. I have to admit, I really don't even understand what I just read.
Yeah, there's some parts at the end which are somewhat complex, but the person who wrote the notes, which I think is just the translators of Josephus' works, are relating this to other aspects. Basically, like, if you want to know more information about those who were taken into Egypt, Josephus talks about some of it here, and then, mentioning the 72 interpreters has to do with the translators of the Septuagint, which apparently, according to this note, he's about to get into. And let's see the part at the end. Okay, and then the last aspect, the Samaritans carried into Egypt under the same princes, doesn't look like that aspect is here in Josephus' works, but is spoken of by the Arabic geographer, whoever that is, and by Scaliger.
Okay. So basically that was all just notating that Ptolemy took Jews and Samaritans captive and led them into Egypt.
Yeah.
And settled them there. Okay.
So it's kind of like this happened to them and this happened to others, and some of it's recorded here, some of it's recorded here, and some of it elsewhere.
Okay. So picking back up in the paragraph under chapter 1, and as he knew that the people of Jerusalem were most faithful in the observation of oaths and covenants, and this from the answer they made to Alexander when he sent an embassage to them after he had beaten Darius in battle, so he distributed many of them into garrisons, and at Alexandria gave them equal privileges of citizens with the Macedonians themselves, and required of them to take their oaths that they would keep their fidelity to the posterity of those who committed these places to their care. Nay.
Actually, before you continue,
sure.
This is quite interesting, actually, because it talks about how a number of Jews ended up being in Egypt, and you have places like Alexandria, which it mentions right here, which Alexandria, Egypt, was a very, very significant place in the ancient world, and some of the most significant Second Temple writings are related to Jews of Alexandria. So Philo, for instance, is a Jew of the 1st century who is actually a contemporary of Jesus, and his writings have been preserved to us, at least some of his writings, and he was from Alexandria, Egypt. In Alexandria, it was a whole lot more Hellenized than in Jerusalem. They were basically speaking Greek. They were a lot more ingrained into Greek philosophy and so on and so forth. And for instance, in the New Testament, you have Barnabas, who is from Alexandria, Egypt. Or is that Barnabas or Apollos?
I don't remember.
Either Barnabas or Apollos. I'd have to check. It talks about it in Acts. One or the other of them was from Alexandria, Egypt, and spoke with great eloquence, even exceeding Paul, and presented the message so successfully, convinced so many people. So Alexandria, that's a place to be aware of.
Apollos.
Thank you.
Was
Acts 18:24.
Wasn't Alexandria also? Am I not coming through very clearly?
No, but you're better now.
Oh, okay, I have to make an adjustment on my microphone. Wasn't Alexandria also a very important hub for the Catholic Church as like a dividing line of the Eastern and Western Holy Roman Empire? Couldn't you pretty much draw a line from Rome to Alexandria, and that was the East-West division?
If I'm remembering correctly, I believe that at least at one point that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
Another one of the very significant sorry, go ahead.
I think it's like the Orthodox to the east and those that followed the Sunday keeping first were the Western Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And also one of the significant aspects of Alexandria is the Great Library of Alexandria. Probably the greatest library in the ancient world. And according to, I think it's called the Letter of Aristeas, it's in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha published by James Charlesworth, an ancient letter, where he gives the account of the making of the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and he relates it as being basically because Ptolemy wanted to have a translation of the laws of the Jews for the library at Alexandria. So, and I think Josephus will probably get into that here as well, at least at some point.
Didn't that library burn at one time?
Yeah,
there was a lot of things that were lost.
Yeah, it was a very tragic destruction, and if it was never destroyed, in Egypt, that is one of the best places in the world for preserving documents. The climate and everything is excellent for that. And so there may be a lot more important information that we would have had if the library had not been destroyed.
Similar climate to the Dead Sea, not quite as good, but very similar.
Yes, absolutely.
Shall I continue?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So we just left off where which one is it? Agathokides knew that the people of Jerusalem were faithful in observing their oaths, so he makes them citizens with equal privileges to the Macedonians, requires them to take an oath, etc. Nay, there were not a few other Jews who, of their own accord, went into Egypt, as invited by the goodness of the soil and by the liberality of Ptolemy. However, there were disorders among their posterity with relation to the Samaritans on account of their resolution to preserve that conduct of life which was delivered to them by their forefathers, and they thereupon contended one with another, while those of Jerusalem said that their temple was holy, and resolved to send their sacrifices thither. But the Samaritans were resolved that they should be sent to Mount Gerizim.
Okay.
So we're starting to see the contention between the worship at Jerusalem and the worship on Mount Gerizim,
Which is especially manifested and recorded in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like chapter 2 is actually getting into the laws of the Jews being translated into the Greek tongue. So are there any comments or questions by anyone before moving into chapter 2?
Something early in the chapter 1 there, I think, second sentence, occurred to me that the Seventh-day Adventist Church teaches that Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy were the four wings of the leopard beast in Daniel, and never heard of Antigonus before. Thought that was interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I was noting that too. Antigonus is one that I have never heard of. Although in other histories, it's Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy, who are basically the only ones mentioned. So it is quite interesting how there's another there.
Could it be that Asia was somewhat removed from the theater of the Bible, in other words?
I was wondering this, a similar thing. I was wondering if it was just, I was wondering if it had to do with how the Greek world may have viewed Asia, or, whether it was, how much was it under the control of the Greeks at the time. And the other question that I have is, which Asia is this talking about? Because in the New Testament you read Asia a lot. It talks about Asia. But it's not talking about Asia how we think of Asia. It's not talking the Far East. It's talking Asia Minor, which is north of Israel and even a bit to the west. So it'd be interesting to find out if this is Asia Minor or if this is Far East Asia.
And the four generals being significant for the beast with the four wings, the fourth beast, according to Hada. Whereas we see a fifth general here that takes over after the death of Alexander. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Do you think that everyone reading understands that Macedon and Macedonia are isn't that the northeastern portion of Greece?
I'm not familiar enough with the geography of Macedonia to know one way or the other myself. Does anyone here have information on that?
I would say Alexander, the king of Macedon.
Right. The type of Greek way that Alexander had was different than the classical Greeks. Even the type, Koine Greek, was different from the type of Greek spoken in Athens, let's say, a few hundred years before this. Guys like Plato and those guys came 200 years before Alexander's time, and they had a kind of a more pure Greek approach.
Could Macedonia have just been a conquered territory then?
Well, let's see. It looks like...
No,
let's pull up some pictures here.
Now, if we can trust Funkin' Wagnalls here, it says Macedonia, or Macedon, is the ancient kingdom that became a world power under Alexander the Great. It is of the Balkan region, including parts of Greece. Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. So yeah, it is like the northern areas of Greece and beyond.
Okay.
We remember didn't Alexander use elephants to cross the Alps to conquer? If I remember my history correctly.
I believe so, yes.
It's just kind of interesting that some dots are being connected here. This is just a fantastic area to venture into here, and I'm sure there's a lot more to gain from this reading. So
yes, absolutely. And getting into this connects the history of the Jews with the history of other nations of the world a lot more. Reading Daniel and learning how it prophesies of Alexander and so on. I had always kind of wondered, why isn't Alexander's story recorded in the Bible? But that's just because it wasn't in the Bible I had. But very interesting. I'll just mention very recently, actually, within the past maybe even year, might be 2 years now, for the first time, a synagogue was found with a basically with art depicting a quote-unquote non-biblical scene. And it was actually depicting military elephants. And it was definitely taken from the books of the Maccabees, and there was other scenes depicted in this synagogue art that was, pretty well taken from the Maccabees. You can find out about it on from Biblical Archaeology Review. They have a website called biblicalarchaeology.org. It's the main organization for real biblical archaeology. You can see pictures of it there if you like. Okay, so any other comments? And if not, would someone like to volunteer to read the first part of chapter 2?
I guess I can keep reading.
All right, sure, we can do that.
No one wants to tackle those words.
Would you like for me to spell you? Give you a break?
Sure.
I can read it a little.
If you could read the title for chapter 2 as well, that would be great.
Sure, be glad to. Chapter 2. How Ptolemy Philadelphus procured the laws of the Jews to be translated into the Greek tongue and set many captives free and dedicated many gifts to God. This is part 1. When Alexander had reigned 12 years, and after him Ptolemy Soter 40 years, Philadelphus then took the kingdom of Egypt and held it 40 years within one. He procured the law to be interpreted and set free those that were come from Jerusalem into Egypt and were in slavery there, who were 120,000. The occasion was this: Demetrius Philarius, who was library keeper to the king, was now endeavoring, if it were possible, to gather together all the books that were in the habitable earth, and buying whatsoever was anywhere valuable or agreeable to the king's inclination, who was very earnestly set upon collecting of books, to which inclination of his Demetrius was zealously subservient.
Hey, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, just before we continue, I just noticed that there's a note there for us to read. So I thought maybe we'll read it, and then...
Not on ours.
Oh, interesting. Well, in the one I have, there's a note. It's at the word interpreted. It says he procured the law to be interpreted. They have a note here saying, of the translation of the other parts of the Old Testament by 70 Egyptian Jews in the reign of Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, and Philadelphus, as also of the translation of the Pentateuch by 72 Jerusalem Jews in the 7th year of Philadelphus at Alexandria, as given us an account of by Aristeas, and thence by Philo and Josephus, with a vindication of Aristeas' history. And then they say, see the appendix to lit a comp of prof at large. So it's just referencing where we can find more information about this. But basically, the account that is what we're reading of here, according to the note, they're just saying that this is also recorded by Philo and vindicated by the letter of Aristeas, which came before both Philo and Josephus. And again, if anyone wants to be able to read the letter of Aristeas, it is in, I believe it is the first writing in Volume 2 of James Charlesworth's Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, which is a 2-volume set with many, many quote-unquote non-canonical Old Testament writings, which is well worth picking up. It's a very good set. And so this letter of Aristeas is there. So anyways, very, very interesting. This is important stuff that has to do with the history of the Bible, so to speak. So looking forward to hearing the rest of it. But any comments before we move on from anyone?
What footnote number was that?
Well, in mine, I'm reading it from the same book, but in a Logos Bible Software edition. And so for me, it's just footnote A. But apparently it's not on the website.
No, there's no note in what we're reading from. I'm reading from the same thing you are, Mike.
I've got one numbered 3, which I guess is just a continuation from the previous footnote in chapter 1. But I'll stop when I get there. Hopefully, if there's another one before I get to it, let me know.
Sure.
You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have anything first? Going. And when once Ptolemy asked him how many 10,000s of books he had collected, he replied that he had already about 20 times 10,000. 20 times 10,000 would be 200,000, right? Is my math right? Correct me if I'm wrong. But that, in a little time, he would have 50 times 10,000. Wow. But he said he had been informed that there were many books of laws among the Jews worthy of inquiring after and worthy of the king's library, but which, being written in characters and in a dialect of their own, will cause no small pains in getting them translated into the Greek tongue.
Just want to mention here, it's very interesting how he says, but he said he had been informed that there are many books of laws among the Jews. worthy of inquiring after. I think that's worth taking into account that he says many, not just 5.
Here we have a footnote 3. It says, of the translation of the other parts of the Old Testament by 70 Egyptian Jews in the reigns of Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, and Philadelphus, as also of the translation of the Pentateuch by 72 Jerusalem Jews in the 7th year of Philadelphus at Alexandria, has given us an account of by Aristius, and thence by Philo and Josephus, with a vindication of Aristius' history. See the appendix to literal Akorap. I'm not sure what that's an abbreviation of.
Yeah, very, very interesting, because that's the same footnote that I just read, but it's just in a different place.
Ah.
All right, well, good to know.
It, but okay, did not recognize it. Okay. Continuing, that the character in which they are written, speaking of the books of laws from the Jews, seems to be like that which is the proper character of the Syrians, and that is sound, when pronounced, is like theirs also, and that this sound appears to be peculiar to themselves. Wherefore he said that nothing hindered why they might not get these books to be translated also. For while nothing was wanting that is necessary for that purpose, we may have their books also in this library. So the king thought that Demetrius was very zealous to procure him abundance of books, and that he suggested what was exceeding proper for him to do. And therefore he wrote to the Jewish high priest that he should act accordingly.
Any comments? I'll mention briefly, in relation to something we were talking about last night. It mentions here, it says that the character in which they are written seems to be like to that which is the proper character of the Syrians. And that's because the Syrians were writing in Aramaic, and at this time the Hebrews had already borrowed the Aramaic square script for the writing of the Hebrew language. So just wanted to mention that if anyone, since we talked about it last night, and if anyone wanted a historical reference to that, here's one. Would you like to keep going, Mike?
Sure.
All right.
Ready? Part 2. Now there was one Aristius, who was among the king's most intimate friends, and on account of his modesty, very acceptable to him. This Aristius resolved frequently, and that before now, to petition the king that he would set all the captive Jews in his kingdom free. And he thought this to be a convenient opportunity for the making of that petition. So he discoursed, in the first place, with the captains of the king's guards, Sosibius of Tarentum and Andreas, and persuaded them to assist him in what he was going to intercede with the king for. Accordingly, Aristius embraced the same opinion with those that have been before mentioned, and went to the king and made the following speech to him. It is not fit for us, O king, to overlook things hastily, or to deceive ourselves, but to lay the truth open. Amen. For since we have determined not only to get the laws of the Jews transcribed, but interpreted also, for thy satisfaction, by what means can we do this, while so many of the Jews are now slaves in thy kingdom? Do thou then what will be agreeable to thy magnanimity, and to thy good nature. Free them from the miserable condition they are in, because that God, who supporteth thy kingdom, was the author of their laws, as I have learned by particular inquiry. For both these people and we also worship the same God, the framer of all things. We call him, and that truly, by the name of Greek, or life, or Jupiter, because he breathes life into all men. Wherefore, do thou restore these men to their own country, and this do to the honor of God, because these men pay a peculiarly excellent worship to him. And know this further, that though I be not of kin to them by birth, nor one of the same country with them, yet do I desire these favors to be done them, since all men are the workmanship of God. And I am sensible that he is well pleased with those that do good. I do therefore put up this petition to thee, to do good to them. Unquote.
Interesting. One thing that I wanted to mention that was different in the edition that I have of this book as compared to the one that's online, I think where it has the word Greek, it's just a Greek word.
Okay, and where it has the word Greek in relation to the name of the god.
Yes. It says, by the name of Greek, and it has all capital Greek. I think that it was just a Greek word, and they chose to write the word Greek there in this edition for some reason. In the one that I have, it says by the name of Zena, Z-E-N-A. And then in square brackets, it says or life or Jupiter. So wanted to mention that it's because it was a significant difference.
Have any idea about the meaning of the word Zena?
Not really, unless it means life or Jupiter. that's the only.
Right.
Yeah, that's what it appears to be.
That's implied.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's akin to the word zenith, as the utmost or the apex. Well, apex is on the opposite end of the vocabulary, right? The alphabet, rather.
I find it very interesting that this person is saying what a lot of people today say of different belief systems. A lot of people think, oh, it doesn't matter what name you give your God. It's all the same God. Yeah, you worship Jupiter. Yeah, you worship Zeus. Yeah, you worship Baal or whatever, or I don't even know all the names of these other belief systems, gods, necessarily, but you get that a lot. Oh, it's all the same God. Let's say, keep it more contemporary with, you have, the Christians, you have the Jews, you have the Muslims. Those are the three main religions. And a lot of them will all say, oh, it's all the same God. Very interesting.
Very, very interesting indeed. The kind of way, like we talked about before, of kind of incorporating, you hear of gods that have similar stories attached to them, even if it's as basic as, I forget how he puts it here, but basically the framer of all things, that's it. But we worship a God who is supposedly the framer of all things, and they say that their God is the framer of all things, so it must be the same God. Interestingly, though, kind of a different perspective, in James White's booklet called The Personality of God, the second half of it where he's talking about immateriality, and in his poem on immateriality, he talks about the Christian's God, the modern Christian's God. And he says, for such a God, we have no use. And he refers to that God as their God. So it's very interesting how James White was viewing the God of Christendom as being a different God and really a non-existent God, as opposed to the God that he worshipped.
Yeah, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I guess one similar to that one that you just expressed is the Muslim saying that United States is great Satan. Their only impression of Christian is it's Catholic, or for the most part. So it's understandable the misconception that they would have about what true Christianity is.
Well, and likewise, the misconception that most Christians have about the true teaching of Muhammad, and who, you have a lot of different sects of Islam, and some of them are doing atrocious things, very akin to what Christianity did in the Dark Ages. And yet we would say, oh, well, that's not true Christianity. But yet a lot of Christians will say, well, that's true
Islam.
That's true Islam. Yeah. And I don't know how many people have actually read the Quran, and we haven't read all of it. We've read very little, comparatively speaking. But so far what we've read doesn't teach anything violent or anything like that. And the Muslim friend that we've made here in Hearst, very, not a part of the type of Islam that is terrorizing various nations and people. He's very opposed to that sort of thing.
And most Muslims are. Interesting.
Hold on a second, what's that? Hey, Leroy, you got something you want to say?
Yeah, we have the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, there you go.
I think they claim to be Christians, don't they?
They do, yeah.
So did Hitler.
Yeah. He had "In God We Trust" on his belt buckle. I think I remember here. Also, we've been learning about that all the nations had different gods. So that says that they're not all the same God. The gods of the nations.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And viewing things from the perspective of understanding materialism, actually, in one sense, you could say that the majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims are worshiping the same God, in that they claim to worship the immaterial God. And that God, out of all the gods, is the one that actually doesn't exist.
Ironically.
Ironically, yeah. And so they deny the existence of any other gods, which actually do exist, and promote the existence of an immaterial God, which by definition is non-existent. So in that sense, you could say they worship the same supposed God. Although, of course, they have differing and contrary views of that supposed God. And since the God is no more real than the imagination concerning him, then in that sense, again, they would be different as they imagine this God to be. Very, very peculiar circumstances. And then, of course, if you take what Ellen White has to say into account concerning the God who Christians worship, that being Christians who did not follow Christ into the most holy place, you get a little bit fuller of a picture there yet again.
Yeah, they were worshiping Satan unknowingly.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Christian God has a Son who is saving us from sin. I don't think any of the other gods talk about sin or love or salvation.
Well, it depends on how broad you want to put your investigation, I suppose, because, of course, Jews believe that they have a salvation message, although it's different, and so do Muslims, although it's in a different setting, of course. But and other religions also, whether they call it sin or they call it by another name, the purpose of most religions is to reform the person to be more godlike in some regard.
From what I've heard, I never read the Quran either, but they say that, when I'm talking to Muslims, they say that God does not, they don't believe that one person can give their life for somebody else, to save somebody else. And anyway, they got a lot of different things they disagree with about the Bible.
Right, and one of the aspects, we've talked about this actually in a recent meeting, I think it's called The Truth of Sacrifice, and Teresa had emailed it out a while ago, where we talked about, to kind of illustrate the point of the truth of sacrifice, we talked about, I gave an example of how some Muslim scholars object to the Christian doctrine of substitutionary death, and how their objections are actually valid, and how the popular Christian doctrine of substitutionary death is actually false. Notice, I didn't say that substitutionary death is false, but the common Christian doctrine of substitutionary death is false. There is a true idea, but it's different from what is commonly taught, and it's quite understandable why Muslims reject the common idea. And perhaps many of them, if they were to hear the true teaching of sacrifice, would happily accept it. Here's hoping, anyways.
A lot of them are accepting it. A lot of Muslims are becoming Christians. A lot.
True, but again, that's not accepting the truth of what sacrifice is and what true substitutionary death is, because if they're becoming Christians, it just means that they're accepting the false view of substitutionary death.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's an interesting world we live in, but I believe that there is much hope, because just as all of us, we're used to thinking in one certain way before truth on a certain subject is presented to us, and often when it's presented, it's just totally different than how we've ever thought, but all of us here have gladly accepted and rejoiced in it. And so there will be many more, in fact, a great multitude which no man can number, who will hear the truth really for the first time and rejoice and be glad in it.
Amen. Thank you, dear Heavenly Family.
Amen. So, we are partway through a chapter here, so maybe it would be good.
It. Oh, a chapter.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes. Partway through a chapter.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how long.
It's a very long chapter.
It is quite a long chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll see. I think it'd be good to continue on a bit further. Does anyone have any other comments before we do continue on?
I did want to tell Teresa that I agree completely with what she said previously, and then add to it that it's really sad that players on both sides of the issue, Christians, so-called Christians, and so-called Muslims, are the ones that are getting all the media attention these days, and in both cases they are probably not following the writings of the that they claim to hold up as truth. And
right.
Very, very sad.
Indeed. And actually, that just reminded me of an extra side note that I think is worth mentioning. And you can find this if you can read an English translation of the Quran online, and it's divided into sections called surahs, and I believe it's in the second surah where it very, very clearly talks about how we need to read the writings of all the prophets. And it talks about how there are some who read the writings and then kind of pick and choose what they want to believe from it. And it forbids that type of approach and says that we need to believe all that the prophets have written and to read all that they have written. And I think that that's especially an interesting passage for many and perhaps most Muslims today, because the general thought among Muslims is that, they believe that the Quran was delivered to Muhammad and is the very words of Allah, and that the Bible, while it contains the messages of the prophets whom they consider to be true prophets, they believe that Moses was a true prophet and all the prophets of Israel and all of that, but they basically believe that the Bible is corrupted and so therefore not trustworthy, and it's fine to reject however many of the doctrines which are in the Bible, even things as consistent and clear as the Sabbath. However, evidently in Muhammad's day, it was preserved well enough that he could say to read the writings and to believe all that the prophets have written. And now that we have writings of the Hebrew Scriptures and even of the New Testament writings which predate the time of Muhammad, certainly an honest Muslim should be able to see that if they want to be consistent with these passages in the Quran, that they need to be reading and investigating the sacred writings of the Nazarene movement and of the Jews, and taking it very seriously. And that's the only way to really follow that passage in the Quran. And so that opens up basically every doctrine of truth.
I was watching a video of a guy and he seemed to know what he was talking about. He was reading from the Quran, and he read a section where it plainly stated that no harm was to be done to any of the people of the book. And he explained that as being the people of the Bible. So I thought that was very interesting and goes right along with what you were saying, Trent.
Yeah, it talks about how Jews and Christians who follow the information that they have will be saved, and that you're never to do any harm to any of them. And if you ever, it talks about how if your city is attacked, that you can defend yourself, but if they start to retreat, don't chase after them. Don't go and try and kill them in revenge or anything like that. And yeah, very interesting stuff.
So again, there are many. The ones we see the most of in the media are those who pick and choose what they choose to believe and disbelieve. Sad.
Very sad.
They're the ones that get all the attention.
That's right.
I wanted to ask, what did you say that was, Trent? Second Sirah, S-I-R-A or S-I-R-A-C?
S-U-R-A.
Oh, S-U-R-A. Okay.
Yeah. S-U-R-A.
Yeah, it'll be, if it's not in the second Sirah, it's close to the end of the first Sirah, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've read it.
Is that one of the Dead Sea Scrolls or one of the...
No, this is in the Quran.
Oh, in the Quran, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments before we get into this next little section here? All right. Perhaps let's do it. I just want to mention that this aspect of history is very, very important. The writings of the Jews becoming available in Greek. That really opened it up for many Greeks to have the scriptures exposed to them for the first time. And as far as I know, this is the first time that really the Hebrew scriptures were translated into any other language. So this is a great change in Judaism just by the fact of it being exposed to the broader world. Really enhanced the chances of people from other nations accepting Judaism. And indeed, many people from the Greek-speaking world did embrace at least some aspects of Judaism. And when synagogues were established throughout the Greek-speaking world, there were many Greeks who went to the synagogues and studied the writings of the Jews there and, adopted some of the Jewish practices, eating kosher and, doing different things. Although many of them still continued to worship their own gods, they didn't really see a conflict there. They thought that, to them, if they're coming from a pagan perspective, then it's fine to worship all the gods. And so this kind of sets some of the background for some of the things we read of in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, it talks about God-fearers. God-fearers was an actual classification of people in the first century and before the first century who were basically Greek-speaking Gentiles, pagans, who also accepted some of the practices of Judaism. And you have to understand also that for most Greeks at this time, they didn't view the synagogue as as the way we would view it. Today, we categorize things in a very different way than how they did in the ancient world. For us, when we think of worship and religion and things like that, we think of singing and praying and studying sacred texts. That's not how people viewed it in the ancient world. And in fact, the categories of religion and politics and another thing, like those categories were not as defined necessarily as our categories are. But for them, when they thought of worship, they're thinking of rituals in a temple. They're thinking of ritual activity, whether it's animal sacrifice, whether it's reading intestines of a sacrificed animal, or having some other sort of ritual. Those are the things that they would think of as worship behavior, as the religious aspect of life. A synagogue was something totally different. A synagogue to an ancient person was a lot more like going to a philosophy school, because you're there, you're contemplating, you're studying, you're doing this. Even for Jews, for a long time, worship was focused on ritual. It wasn't focused on studying and praying and singing. In fact, when you read things like Leviticus, there's no music attached to the sanctuary service. There's no words even attached to the sanctuary service, except for in a couple instances. Like, there's very, very few times. The vast majority of it, as far as recorded in Leviticus and Numbers, is just totally silent. Other than sometimes there's a blowing of trumpet and stuff like that. But there's no music, no words, nothing like that. And worship was very much wrapped up in ritual for a long time, until synagogues, and that only came about after the dispersion of the Jews, the diaspora. And so that's why many Gentiles were actually attracted to Judaism, because it had a form of religious belief that was different in so many ways, because it wasn't as focused on ritual anymore. And one of the reasons for that is because Judaism believed that, hey, the place where we are supposed to do ritual is only in Jerusalem. So they weren't setting up temples everywhere else. And since they weren't in the land of Israel anymore, they had to have some other way of staying together, preserving the beliefs and so on. And that's when they established synagogues, started studying. And what were they studying throughout the diaspora? Well, yeah, sure, they did have some Torah scrolls and they would have some Hebrew writing, but a lot of it would be going on in Greek, and that's why many Greeks were able to attend the synagogues. So the translation of these writings into Greek made a huge impact on Judaism and the ancient world altogether. So I just wanted to kind of pause and reflect on that for a moment before continuing on, because it's a significant event.
And that library, isn't that the one that burned down?
Which, you're talking about the Library of Alexandria?
Yeah, one of the big libraries like that burned down. They lost a lot of books. I was thinking maybe that was the one.
Well, yeah, there was the Library of Alexandria that burnt down. Just for clarity, though, that's not what I was referring to now or anything. But, yeah, that's an event that happened that was quite significant. But I guess maybe you're mentioning in terms of that library is what they're translating it for. So yes, that is the library.
Right. I was just saying it was sad that we don't have it anymore. It burned out.
Very sad. There are many scholars who are very, very sad about that because just a wealth of knowledge that is gone. But we do have the Greek translation of the Old Testament, so that's good that was preserved. So would anyone like to volunteer to read the next section, or were there more comments on these aspects first?
Mike, do you feel like continuing to read?
Sure, I'll read another section at least.
Awesome.
We ready?
Yep.
Part 3. When Aristeus was saying thus, the king looked upon him with a cheerful and joyful countenance and said, quote, "How many 10,000s dost thou suppose there are of such as want to be made free?" Unquote. To which Andreas replied, as he stood by and said, quote, "A few more than 10 times 10,000, unquote. The king made answer, quote, "And this is a small gift that thou askest, Aristeus," unquote. But Josephus and the rest that stood by said that he ought to offer such a thank offering as was worthy of his greatness of soul to that God who had given him his kingdom. With this answer he was much pleased, and gave order that when they paid the soldiers their wages, they should lay down, bracket 100 and bracket 20 drachmas for every one of the slaves. Well, there's a question mark there, but it didn't read like a question. They should lay down 120 drachmas for every one of the slaves. And we have a footnote.
In mine it doesn't have a question mark there.
Oh, how about that? We have a footnote, number 4, and it reads, although this number, 120 drachmae of Alexandria, or 60 Jewish shekels, be here 3 times repeated, and that in all Josephus copies, Greek and Latin, yet since all the copies of Aristeus, whence Josephus took his relation, have this sum several times, and still as no more than 20 drachmae, or 10 Jewish shekels. And since the sum of the talents to be set down presently, which is little above 460, for somewhat more than 100,000 slaves, and is nearly the same in Josephus and Aristeus, does better agree to 20 than to 120 drachmae. And since the value of a slave of old was at the most but 30 shekels, or 60 drachmae, see Exodus 21:32, while in the present circumstances of these Jewish slaves, and those so very numerous, Philadelphus would rather redeem them at a cheaper than a dearer rate. There is great reason to prefer here Aristeus's copies before Josephus's.
Okay, so the letter of Aristeus has 20 drachmae as opposed to 120 as is found in Josephus, and I guess they're just giving the reasons why 20 is the preferable number, the more likely historical reality.
And that explains why 100 and is put in brackets, because they're basically saying that was inserted or doesn't really belong to, what's the guy's name? Aristeus's version.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Proceeding, and he promised to publish a magnificent decree about what they requested, which should confirm that Aristeus had proposed, and especially what God willed should be done, whereby he said he would not only set those free who had been led away captive by his father and his army, but those who were in this kingdom before, and those also, if any such there were, who had been brought away since. And when they said that their redemption money would amount to above 400 talents, he granted it. A copy of which decree I have determined to preserve, that the magnanimity of this king may be made known. Its contents were as follows, quote, "Let all those who were soldiers under our father, and who, when they overran Syria and Phoenicia and laid waste Judea, took the Jews captives and made them slaves, and brought them into our cities and into this country, and then sold them, as also all those that were in my kingdom before them, and if there be any that have been lately brought thither, be made free by those that possess them, and let them accept of, brackets again, 100 and brackets, close brackets, 20 drachmas for every slave, and let the soldiers receive this redemption money with their pay, but the rest out of the king's treasury, for I suppose that they were made captives without our father's consent and against equity, and that their country was harassed by the insolence of the soldiers, and that by removing them into Egypt, the soldiers have made a great profit by them. Out of regard, therefore, to justice, and out of pity to those that have been tyrannized over, contrary to equity, I enjoin those that have such Jews in their service to set them at liberty, upon the receipt of the before-mentioned sum, and that no one else may deceit about them, but obey what is here commanded. And I will that they give in their names within 3 days after the publication of this edict to such as are appointed to execute the same, and to produce the slaves before them also, for I think it will be for the advantage of my affairs. And let everyone that will inform against those that do not obey this decree, and I will that their estates be confiscated into the king's treasury." Unquote. When this decree was read to the king, it at first contained the rest that is here inserted, and omitted only by those Jews that had formerly been brought, and those brought afterwards, which had not been distinctly mentioned. So he added these clauses out of his humanity and with great generosity. He also gave order that the payment, which was likely to be done in a hurry, should be divided among the king's ministers and among the officers of his treasury. When this was over, what the king had decreed was quickly brought to a conclusion, and this in no more than 7 days' time, the number of the talents paid for the captives being above 460, and this because their masters required the bracket 100 and close bracket 20 drachmas for the children also, the king having, in effect, commanded that these should be paid for, when he said in his decree that they should receive the aforementioned sum for every slave.
That is quite something. There's a couple aspects that I want to mention. I'll mention the more trivial one first. The more trivial one is, here Josephus is recording a copy of the decree. And when you in some of these writings, it's most likely a real historical decree. It's probably a true copy. Josephus, being so connected high up within the Roman imperial system, would probably not be respected very well if he was just making up decrees of former Greek rulers. And not only that, just looking at decrees like this in other writings, for instance, you find this in Ezra. It records decrees of Artaxerxes and Cyrus and so on. And those decrees, especially the decrees by Cyrus, have been verified by historians, as in they've found very similar decrees that Cyrus had made. And so it would be very difficult to say that those are just made-up decrees. Likewise, you have the decrees recorded in the books of the Maccabees, all of which are most likely real historical decrees. And so this one, again, is kind of in that same category. That's the more trivial aspect. The more important matter is the setting at liberty these very many Jewish slaves. I mean, this is a huge, significant event. And something that I think if we don't understand slavery in the ancient world, we will kind of miss some of its significance. For many decades, classical scholars, as in people who study the classic Greek and Roman writings, have kind of brushed off Greek and Roman slavery as being not that bad, and kind of portraying it as though, oh, you were treated like you're part of the family and this and that. But ever since the 1990s, scholars have come forward a lot more honestly, basically, and with a lot more information, actual manuscripts, slave letters, records of, receipts for slaves and all these different things. And it was awful. It was actually along the same lines as slavery in America. Like, it was really, really bad. There's a record of slaves being sold as young as a couple years old. It was the norm for slaves, and especially children, women and children, but children of both genders, to be sex slaves. And they were, a whip was like the common symbol for a slave in the ancient Greco-Roman world. They were regularly beaten and tortured, and they were systematically separated from their family members, given different names, not allowed to retain their identity, different language, different religion, basically all of the aspects that were there in American slavery occurred in some form in ancient Greco-Roman slavery. So this isn't any light thing that, these Jews were sold as slaves, and so now you have, 100,000 or over 100,000 Jews, and they're in slavery. That's a huge thing in itself. And now they're being set free. That's an incredible thing. Stuff like that didn't happen every day in the Greco-Roman system. You don't just set free slaves. Slaves were basically destined generation after generation after generation to be slaves. And then in the closing years, eventually they worked out a system where a slave could be a freed man, but a freed man still wasn't a free man. You know, you could be a free man, you're just born free. A freed man still wasn't the same as a free man in the Roman system. You basically had done well enough for yourself that you would be no longer counted a slave, but basically your former slave master was still your boss. You still had to work for him, but now you could, like, you know, actually have your own money and a lot more of your own possessions, had a little bit more freedom and everything, but you're still counted, you know, way low class and not really, you know, you're not a citizen or anything like that. So that's a huge deal to have any of these slaves be freed, and have a huge amount of slaves be freed as is described here is an extremely significant and huge event, something that would have been noted by the whole surrounding world at that time. Absolutely incredible. Any comments from anyone?
You know, we're told that after the American Civil War, when slavery was abolished, that many slaves continued to live in slavery for years afterwards, that the news just trickled out, you know. And here we see that the king said that, I just had it, that let everyone that will inform against those who do not obey this decree, and I will that their estates be confiscated to the king's treasury. And then he goes on to say, when this was over, what the king had decreed was quickly brought to a conclusion, and this in no more than 7 days' time. Quite a difference.
Quite a difference, and especially it's actually setting free all the slaves. I mean, the 13th Amendment wasn't actually quite like that. The 13th Amendment actually did not totally abolish slavery. It abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. So even in the 13th Amendment, it still has slavery as being lawful, as awful as that is, as punishment for a crime. And so I'm not sure one way or the other if there were any laws after that which actually totally outlawed slavery. I hope so. But, I mean, the nature of this in the 13th Amendment is totally not the same spirit that we're reading of here. I mean, what we're reading of here, you know, Josephus, he mentioned the first edition of this, you know, failed to mention those Jews who had come beforehand or whatever, but then in the goodness of his heart and everything, he added that clause out of his humanity and with great generosity. So he's actually like really wanting to free the Jews and making sure to phrase things carefully to make sure that all Jews who are enslaved become free. But, I mean, man, the 13th Amendment, if you abolish slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, all a slave master would have to do is basically accuse their former slave of a crime, and so long as the sheriffs and whoever else, the local government, would convict the person, then basically they're a slave again.
Mm-hmm.
You know? I mean, that's really all it took. And then even those who were no longer enslaved, they were basically put in, like, they were slaves to circumstance, because, I mean, racism didn't end with the 13th Amendment, you know? And so it was very, very difficult. Like, how do you go from slavery to living, you know, any sort of stable life in America, surrounded by people who very recently had the ability and actually made use of that ability to totally, I don't even have the words, but basically torment you. And it's, yeah, I mean, like you said, it was just a very, very, very slow process to get even to where we are today. And obviously, the issues aren't over. But,
amen to that.
Yeah, it's incredible, though, reading about this ancient account and seeing a different sort of spirit. And keep in mind, this is written by a Jew, so it's not like a Greek or a Roman writing about how wonderful they were in freeing all these Jewish slaves. No, it's not like that. This is written by a Jew, so it's more likely to be a credible account. As a side note, when Jews, or not when Jews, but in the Greco-Roman world, when slaves most commonly would be freed is as part of the will of their master. And the reason why is because it was considered such a like a generous thing. So it was really, they were doing it just for their own reputation. Some people would say, oh, how kind-hearted and how generous of him being so good to those slaves, you know, like that's how they viewed it. And I mean, it's awful, but yeah, it was slave culture. Like that's just how it was in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, you read about it in the New Testament, slavery is spoken of just as like just a regular part of life. And because unfortunately it was.
The thought crossed my mind how much I appreciate, how much I thank the Heavenly Family for drawing me into the rod message. Because prior to that, I didn't know that many people other than of my own race. And I hesitate to use that word. I think we're all humans.
Amen.
People, I didn't know that many people with a skin that was colored different from mine. And through the rod message, I got to know a lot of Jamaican people and a lot of people from Guyana. And they are now among the most near and dear to my heart of any people I've ever met. And the color of their skin has nothing to do with my affection for those people. They are honest and honorable and hardworking, and I call them my friend, and I pray for them. And praise Heavenly Family for growing me up in that regard.
Amen. Thank you so much, Heavenly Family.
Amen.
Any other comments from anyone? We have been on for quite a while now, and I know we're not done the chapter, but it's a long one apparently. So
yeah, we won't finish it tonight.
Yeah, we won't finish it. I think we should actually close off, or come to a close anyways, and continue this tomorrow night. Extremely important history. Many, many lessons to learn from this, and this history has greatly impacted every subsequent event leading up to our day. I mean, if you think, even just from a secular point of view, this is extremely important history, because if it wasn't for the translation of Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, it wouldn't be possible, really, to have quote-unquote Christianity grow as it did and to become such a dominant force. And basically this shaped what we now know as the Western world. So it's changed everything. All right. Well, if no one else has any comments, would somebody like to volunteer to pray?
Heavenly Family, thank you for the opportunity to gather tonight and learn more about you. Thank you for these Hanukkah blessings and this journey that you're taking us on, showing us more truth and more light so we can become more like you. Please be with us as we continue the study for the remaining days of Hanukkah, and please be with us as we prepare for the new moon on most likely Sabbath. So thank you for everyone that could be here tonight, and for those that could not, may they also be blessed in the recording when they are able to listen. In your love, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.